Hello and welcome to episode 2 of 10-Minute Astrology. Today we're discussing astrology's mechanics. So we're going to define some common terms used in astrology as well as the basic outlines of how a chart is created. This can get pretty technical, and while this information is fascinating and important to know, it's not something that's applied in a practical way in everyday astrological interpretation. So if this episode threatens to melt your brain, don't be frightened away or overwhelmed. It gets less technical from here. But if you want an introduction to how it all works, keep watching. While we know that the Earth is one of the many planets that revolves around the Sun, our observation is that these bodies actually seem to revolve around us. Most astrological techniques are geocentric, which means to put Earth in the center. Astrology is about our relationship to what we see, rather than the objective data, like considering the Earth as the center of the solar system instead of the Sun. It's our experience of and relationship with these observations that astrology is concerned with. Astrology is based on two things: observation and correlation. Observing the planetary movements while observing things happening on Earth, and seeing if there's any correlation between the two. Astrology subscribes to the idea of macrocosm and microcosm, where smaller patterns are representations in themselves of larger patterns, such as the contained system of a human life can be a representation of the larger cycle of things, like a divine order of the universe. The ancient and well-known phrase, "as above, so below," is an expression of this idea. Now let's talk about the signs. The circumference of a circle is measured in 360 degrees. If we could see the entirety of the sky all at once, including below our current location on Earth and all sides, we would call it a circle. There are 12 signs, and each of them is contained in a 30-degree section of sky designated to belong to them. And they form a circle around the Earth, called the zodiac, which means wheel of life, or sometimes called circle of animals. Now the planets appear to move around the Earth, traveling through these signs. For purposes of convenience, the Sun and Moon are also called planets. When people think of the signs, they typically think of constellations associated with those signs, like Cancer and the constellation of the Crab. However, the signs and constellations are not the same thing. Hang on to your seats, because this can get complicated. The astrological methods described in this series are based on tropical astrology, sometimes referred to as Western astrology. Tropical astrology is based on the tropical or solar year, which means that the year is defined by the length of time that the Sun takes to return to its same position in its cycle of seasons: spring, summer, fall, and winter. Now I'm sure you've noticed that the Sun seems to rise and set at a different place throughout the year, sometimes reaching high into the sky before setting, and sometimes never getting very high at all. The amount of sunlight we get in a day also varies throughout the year. There are 4 turning points, called tropics, that are typically marked on our calendars, and they highlight the peaks in this rhythm of light. These are the winter solstice, the vernal or spring equinox, the summer solstice, and the autumnal equinox. The solstices, roughly 6 months apart from each other, define the turning point where the axis on which the Earth spins reaches a point where it's tilted as far away or as far toward the Sun as possible. The equinoxes, also roughly 6 months apart from each other, define the turning point where the axis on which the Earth spins reaches a point where it's perpendicular to the Sun, neither tilted away from or toward. So what does this have to do with astrology? Well, you'll recall I just said that I'm presenting the method of tropical astrology, and tropical astrology defines the beginning point of Aries as the point when the spring equinox occurs. The beginning point of Aries is important because this is the sign considered to be the beginning of the zodiac circle. The beginning point of Cancer corresponds with the summer solstice, the beginning point of Libra corresponds with the autumnal equinox, and the beginning point of Capricorn corresponds with the winter solstice. Now, as you can see, the point at which each of these events occur varies slightly within a small range of days each year. So, for example, the Sun rises against the backdrop of the sky while in the sign of Aries, when the vernal equinox occurs. So back to this idea of the signs and the constellations not being the same thing. When astrology was being developed and the beginning point of Aries was established, the Sun rose into the part of the sky that contained the constellation of Aries, the Ram. The sign of Aries and the constellation of Aries were essentially the same thing. They marked the same point. However, due to a phenomenon called the precession of the equinoxes, the Sun's rise into the constellation of Aries no longer corresponds with the moment of the vernal equinox. So 2 basic systems of astrology split off from each other when this fact was realized. One was tropical astrology, based on the tropical year, which continued to mark the first point of Aries as connected to the Sun's movement through the seasons, relative to us on Earth. The other was sidereal astrology, based on the sidereal year, which continued to mark the first point of Aries as the sun began to rise into the constellation of Aries. The sidereal year is slightly longer than the tropical year, and this difference has become larger and larger over time. Eventually, these 2 points will align again, but to do so will take about 26,000 years. Now, it's important to note that astrology contains a lot of variations and split-offs like this, and arguing which one is better or more true is like arguing religion. While astrology is not a religion, one method cannot be proved to be more true than the other through any kind of objective data. Let's discuss the houses. Like the signs, the houses are divisions of space. However, they are connected to the cycle of an Earth day, whereas the signs are connected to the idea of an Earth year. Again, we go back to the idea of astrology being about what we personally observe, rather than the objective data. For instance, we all know the Earth is roughly a round ball orbiting the Sun in space, but our visual experience of Earth, being on it, is that it's flat, and we watch objects move around our sky, sometimes above us, sometimes rising over the horizon and setting into the ground, below our sight. That all occurs because the Earth is spinning, but to us, it looks like everything around us is moving. Let's take a look at 2 terms, the horizon and the meridian. The horizon is the apparent flat line where the Earth ends and the sky begins. The meridian, not something we can actually see like the apparent horizon, is an imaginary line that runs vertically, dividing the sky and Earth in half. These 2 lines form a cross, and they mark 4 points on the natal chart: the ascendant, the descendant, the midheaven, and the nadir. The other house divisions are filled in within this cross. Now back to the idea of the sky appearing to rotate around us, even though it's us doing the actual turning. As the sky, and the signs and planets, move around us, they pass from below us, up over the horizon, and into the sky. They do this in a continual motion, roughly once every 24 hours. So signs appear to rise and set in succession as our Earth day progresses, and if any planets are hanging out in those signs, they rise and set along with them. Notice the ascendant is marked at the horizon. The ascendant is the sign that is rising at any given time, and it's called the ascendant because it ascends over the horizon. Easy, right? Now remember, the horizon is the edge of the Earth, the separation of Earth and sky, and that's going to be different depending on where you are on the planet. So let's say you're here on the Earth, and apparently you're a giant. The horizon is here, where Earth ends and the sky begins, according to your view and location. So if we look at where the signs are right now, Aquarius would be rising. However, at the same moment, in a different location on Earth, Taurus is rising. So it's key to remember that all the houses are entirely based on your actual physical location on Earth, and the time at which you happen to be observing the sky. This is a vast subject and one that can only be covered in brief here. The credits in this episode will have further reading suggestions to deepen your understanding. Join me next time for episode 3 when we'll talk about the actual interpretation of the components. Till then, keep looking up!